To our partners and colleagues, we are pleased that you could join us for another learning opportunity. Today's webinar will be a presentation by AGRA State Capability Team in partnership with Volcani International Partnerships and Tony Blair Institute. Kindly note that the webinar will be recorded, and also please type in your questions at any time during the presentation on the questions window provided on the screen. Kindly join me now in welcoming Thierry Ngoga, Head of State Capability, who will be our moderator for this session. Over to you, Thierry.
Thank you very much, Jen. Thanks everyone for joining this webinar. I would like to start by introducing the panelists. As you heard from Jen, today we are sharing experience from Israel agriculture transformation and what we think are really key lessons for developing countries. So we have Danielle Abraham. She's the Executive Director of Volcani International Partnership. She's joined by Mirav Yashin, who is a technical advisor to the Tony Blair Institute, as well as Jonathan Said, who leads the Inclusive Growth and Private Sector Development Partnership at the Tony Blair Institute. We also have Apollos Nwamfo, who's the Vice President, Policy, State Capability, and Regional Food Trade. Before we kick with our session, I would like to invite Apollos to give us very brief introductory remarks, where he's going to focus on why Israel and why this paper. Apollos, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Thierry, and great to have all of you joining us for this webinar. We think it's actually important, given the fact that countries will need to recover from the shock of COVID-19 and also grow their economies going forward. So first of all, I think it's important to say that this webinar will give us a perspective of how Israel did that amidst what it was going through as a new nation, so to speak. Maybe first of all, I also like to welcome Danielle and Mira, and of course Jonathan, who hopefully should be joining us shortly. First of all, I think it's important to put this in perspective. Like many African countries, Israel, as far as agriculture was concerned, was a new nation. Quite a number of those who settled in Israel, did not have experience in what you might, consider as farming or agriculture. The second was that most of or more than 50% of the land in Israel is semi-arid or arid. A third is that there's shortage of water, and Israel was not necessarily close to export markets, so it was not necessarily what you might call a trade corridor, so to speak. So with all these challenges, Israel was able to overcome them, and achieve agricultural transformation. The question was how. I'm sure our panelists will share with you some of the key drivers of change, that brought about that agricultural transformation. And interestingly, one of the things that has caught my attention is innovation. And with COVID-19 not going away, because we're not going to see COVID-19 in the medium and long term, depending on the analysis you choose to ride with, innovation is going to be the key going forward. The second thing is that quite a number of our African countries have now returned back to agriculture as the opportunity to recover and drive their economies going forward. The question is, how are they going to do it? And part of the challenge with many African states is that they are borrowing monies. In the last 6 to 7 months, many African countries have borrowed over $50 billion, from the IFIs, like the World Bank and the IMF. But that's not inclusive of some of the monies they've taken from the Africa Finance Corporation or the African Development Bank, and then that means that it's actually more than $50 billion. What does that mean? How is that money going to be used? And this is what we need to learn, from the Israel case study, of how Israel has transformed and become, probably a net exporter of a number of agricultural products. And finally, we see that farmer organizations have played a huge role, in Israel's agricultural transformation journey. The question is, how did they do that? So we will be hearing from the panelists how all these drivers of change played out in the course of achieving agricultural transformation, and that's really important for us. A second set of issues that we're hoping that this webinar should help us respond to is to understand, what are the non-transferable contextual issues that Israel had, but also to then take a deep dive into what are the unique things about a number of our African states that are non-transferable, but will be critical in driving agricultural transformation. And linked to that is then to understand what can we adapt from how Israel has actually transformed. What lessons can we transfer? What approaches can we transfer, and see how we implement them by way of policy and practice, to ensure that we are beginning to think forward. And I think as much as I've mentioned it, let us consider the fact that the elephant in the room is COVID-19. And the analysis from COVID-19 is showing us that first, 49 million more people globally are being driven into hunger pockets. Now, but more than 70% of them are in this continent. A second thing is that COVID-19 has become the most influential issue affecting structural shifts from economies to technologies to climate change, to food security and nutrition. The question is no longer what are we going to do post-COVID? It's what can we do now that we know that COVID is here with us, sadly. And finally is around the fact that we've seen that from the way COVID has impacted on agricultural systems, and other similar systems like food systems, inclusive, that we have a challenge of resilience. What are we going to do about building resilient institutions, ensuring that policies take that into account, and that resilience is mainstreamed into the practice of agriculture, right from the strategic level where investment plans are prepared, a political agenda is set, down to the delivery level at the farmer level, where the farmer needs to ensure that he's able to produce, or she's able to produce, in the midst of COVID and sell at reasonable farm gate prices, to the processor, to the markets, and all that, and to reduce issues like post-harvest losses. I think these are things that we want to, we need to discuss at this webinar, and I'm hoping that our panelists will be able to address quite a number of these issues. So finally, I'll say to everyone again, welcome, and we're looking forward to having a fruitful discussion. Thank you. Over to you, Thierry.
Thanks very much, Apollos, for a very good introduction. Before we start, we just want to engage our audience. It's not only for the panelists to speak today. We want to hear from you. I'm going to launch a few questions. It's about Israel. We want to test your geographical knowledge of Israel. 2 minutes to answer all the questions. So as I launch, please take 20 seconds to respond to each question. I'm counting now. 20 seconds for this question, and then I'll move to the next one before we dive deep into the meat of this conversation today. 10 seconds to go for the first question.
%0.5%.
Apollos, can you mute, please?
Oh, sorry.
Good. I'm closing question 1. Now moving to question 2. 20 seconds. Good. Closing question 2. Now moving to question 3, which is the last one. Five seconds to go. Thank you very much. Back to the presentation. Before we dive deep, I want just to give you a quick description of what is going to be presented today, summarized into 4 main parts. Part 1 is around the historical context of Israel as a nation. 2 is around actually what Apollos talked about, how Israel managed to be where it is today. The third part is now what are those critical, relevant lessons for developing countries. And the fourth is another engagement with the audience. So for now, I would like just to call Danielle to take us through the presentation. Danielle, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thierry, and it's great to be here with everyone today. I'm very excited to dive in, and I normally like to open this presentation with a request to see a show of hands, which is obviously a little bit difficult in the webinar format, but let's go for it anyway. At home, wherever you're sitting, please raise your hand if you've actually been to Israel. Okay, so what I would like to do now is actually to invite all of those of you who have not visited Israel. After this COVID crisis is over, you have a standing invitation to come to Israel to see the agriculture firsthand. And for those of you who have visited Israel, I would like you to back me up when I tell everyone here today that Israel is not a natural nor sensible place to do agriculture. As we heard just before from Apollos, you know that Israel is a very small country. Over 2/3 of the land is desert, semi-arid or arid. There is a lack of water resources. Situated in a difficult neighborhood, its export markets are just that much further afield. And it had mass immigration in the early days, and I can guarantee that none of them really had a farming background. Yet despite these seemingly insurmountable challenges, Israel in its very, very short history managed to not only create an agricultural transformation, but has really emerged as a global leader of agriculture and water management. So the obvious question is, how on earth did it succeed? And that's exactly what we're discussing today. Just to give you a sense of what some of its success looks like in terms of its production, you can see here some of the statistics on the screen. Now here down in the bottom left is the statistics about post-harvest. You were just questioned on. Some of you would have got it right. And if you heard Apollo shout out the answer, definitely. 0.5% is really, I think, a global record of post-harvest loss. That is versus 20% worldwide, and I am sure it's higher, I know it to be higher, across Africa as a whole. The Israelis, I can tell you, especially on the dairy farms, are very proud of the highest cow milk productivity in the world, with 13,000 litres per cow versus 6,000 litres in Europe. And you can see some production statistics about citrus and tomatoes above. Now, Thierry, if we just go to the next slide, you will be able to see here Israel's fantastic achievement in actually making the desert bloom. Israel, 2/3 desert, has accomplished something remarkable. When you start driving around the desert, you start to see green coming up, and they've made the 2/3 desert in Israel a hyper-productive area. It's home to over 40% of Israel's vegetables, and also home to lots of new agricultural industries, from aquaculture to date palms to jojoba, which is for the cosmetic industry. And so if we go to the next slide, Thierry, the question once again that everybody asks when they come to Israel and see this is, well, how on earth did Israel succeed? This is asked by numerous African delegations when they come. And arguably the more interesting question is not only how did Israel succeed, but what lessons might its story hold for other nations today that are aspiring towards this agricultural transformation. So to save you the job of schlapping around in very high temperatures across the desert to interview everybody in Israel about its agricultural history, we did that for you. And I can share with you today that we found two key things. The first is that every country is unique. And in Israel, they had three unique underlying elements which really created a situation in which both the government and the people felt that they had no choice but to succeed. There was this national embrace of agriculture as a national mission, and they were not going to accept failure as an answer. They were determined to succeed. And the second thing that we learned is that this determination drove these 5 enabling elements. And these 5 enabling elements are the ones that we are claiming can easily, or not so easily, be replicated by governments today. And what we would like to do is quickly run through each of these 8 points with you to give you a sense of what Israel did and how it did it. So we're going to start with the underlying elements and ideology as a national mission. Now, you cannot understand Israel's agricultural transformation without really getting to grips with what is going on here in the picture. And once again, in person, I would usually ask you to do something, which I'm going to ask you to do on the webinar anyway. So I'd actually like to invite you all to take a moment and close your eyes. And I would actually like to ask you or invite you to imagine that the year is 1901 and you are a fly on the wall of a middle-class salon in Vienna. Okay? Over in the corner of the salon, you see the beautiful black grand piano. But what is really capturing your attention here are the 4 young adults, probably aged between 18 to 22, huddled round the dining table, poring over this map of the land of Israel. And you can hear their conversation. They're discussing their imminent immigration to this swampy, malaria-infested, hot, dry, rocky land in the middle of the Middle East, giving up everything that they have in their comfort of their homes and probably their careers as a doctor or a lawyer to go and embrace agriculture. Now you can open your eyes and have a look again at this picture on the screen. This is a picture of those 4 youths. This is what happened across the country. Basically, people left the comfort of their homes and were driven by this ideology to embrace farming. Nothing else explains what you can see in this picture, which is them draining malaria-infested swamps. Now, what really is going on here is that they were inspired and galvanized by an ideology. It was the modern Zionist ideology that really ignited this passion and connection to the land that really hadn't been felt since Bible times. The Jewish people that emigrated were not farmers. And inspired by, communist Russia and things, what's important for you to grasp here is the idealization of the status of the farmer. Forget going to university and forget making money. There was no better thing you could do with your life than to become a farmer. And they almost held this up high on a pedestal. And this was what drove people to leave the comfort of their homes and plunge first into these malaria-infested swamps to really develop the agriculture. Now, Tia, if we go to the next slide, the second underlying element is what we've termed the pioneer mindset. Now, once you understand that this internal motivation and drive to do agriculture, you'll understand this mindset of the pioneers that moved there. They were stubborn, they were impatient, a little bit like Israelis, like we are today, and they were not going to accept no for an answer. Failure was not an option. And this mindset to succeed at all costs characterized the early pioneers, but also characterizes a lot of Israelis and those involved in agriculture today. You can see this quote on the screen. This was something someone said to us when we were interviewing them. He's the head of one of the local R&D agricultural stations in Israel. And he said, of course, failure is an option. Don't forget, nothing is impossible until we prove it is impossible. So their attitude is that everything can be achieved and nothing is impossible. Just test us. And the last underlying element, Thierry flicks the screen, is actually historical inheritance. Now, every country has a different history, but in Israel specifically, the British that had been there left behind some fantastic infrastructure, both in terms of roads and railways, which really facilitated this agricultural transformation. And in addition, they actually had established some great institutions. For example, they'd established crop marketing boards. Now, I know that they've done this in other countries. For example, in Ghana, you have the cocoa board. Well, in Israel, you had the citrus board, and you might have heard of the Jaffa oranges that were famous. And this really helped Israel lay the foundations at the beginning for spurring this agricultural transformation. And that is the end of the underlying elements in section 1.
Thanks very much, Danielle. I think it's very fascinating historical background. I think now I just want to ask Mirav, you are based in Tel Aviv. In many African countries, traditionally, actually, anybody who didn't have any activity to do was called a farmer. Myself, I was born in a country where during the census, anybody who had no job was actually registered as a farmer because farming was not really seen as a lucrative activity. In Israel, we see a totally different perspective. What do you think Israel actually saw in a farmer, that a farmer was actually made a national hero? From what Danielle has actually described, people migrated from where they had good life to come and farm in a land which has nothing to do with farming, basically hardship. What are your views? You are muted.
Yes, thank you, Chori. So actually, one of these pioneers was my grandfather that immigrated in the turn of the century to Israel and worked to build a kibbutz. He was a physician, a mathematician, but all he wanted written on his ID card was that he is a farmer, because he came with that mindset. He came with a mindset of building the country and owning the country from the ground up, sorry, and really working the land and being connected to the country and to the entire Zionist idea through the land was so important. It was the ideal, and it was a national mission, sorry. But for many else that came in after, because you need to remember Israel is a country that immigrants flooded with immigration throughout its first decades, and still is not in COVID times, but in other times. So really it was important to maintain that status, and not only maintain that status that came in with the pioneers, but also strengthening the ethos of the farmer, and the ethos of the farmer as a leader of the national mission. And I believe that the way that it was done in Israel was first and foremost education, education, education on all levels, from kindergarten kids all the way up to higher education, with the agricultural boarding school at the early years being the prestigious schools where all the leaders and generals went to. It really became the place to go to, the thing to learn and excel in. But beyond that, there was a lot of need to strengthen that ethos, and that was done through culture, and for a lack of a better word, cultural indoctrination. And I think that only when I started working with wonderful colleagues on this panel, on this report, did I realize just how many songs and stories and folk tales there are about the hero farmer and the national mission, and how they made the desert bloom against all odds. And I think that really, really makes an impact. Having that that messaging and that ethos repeated in all aspects is really, really important to maintain. And to wrap up, although the story of Israel, as Danielle said and Apollo said, is not replicable in all ways, I do think there is a lot to build on these foundations of education and cultural strengthening of this ethos. Thank you.
Much, Mirav. We will continue to receive questions from the audience. It's not all about infrastructure only. It's not all about money and resources. It's also about the mindset and the culture. A very important element as we continue this discussion. So Danielle, can you take us through the next part of this conversation?
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much. So The first element we actually want to speak to right now is the government commitment to agriculture and the strong leadership that Israel's government in the early days really displayed. Now you understand this ideology. They were driven by this ideology. And I think the most striking thing was the total government commitment and this real embrace of agriculture as a national mission. And I think you can see this in three key ways. The first was their understanding and determination to support the farmer at all costs. One of the former ministers of agriculture, Shalom Simchon, said to us when we were interviewing him, you know, it is the job of the farmer to grow his chicken as well as he can. The farmer isn't the one that has to worry about the whole value chain. In the early days, that was the role of the government. And the government stepped in and provided holistic support to Israel's early farmers. The second point I'd like to make here was about clear and consistent policy planning and the prioritization of agriculture. Now, what's important to understand here that because the whole government was embracing agriculture as a national mission, it wasn't really seen just as the remit of the Minister of Agriculture. You had buy-in across the cabinet and across the parliament. And it might not surprise you to know, therefore, that not only was Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, a farmer, but so were most of his cabinet and over a third of the Israeli parliament. So now you really understand that their dedication to farming. And the third element here about the government commitment and strong leadership was their ability, because of it, to take bold decisions and really back it up with budget. And I know Thierry said it's not all about infrastructure and financing, but that is definitely a part of it. And I want to tell you a very quick story to illustrate Israel's government commitment here at the beginning with a bold decision. So the picture here you see here on the right is of the first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. And his big vision was to make Israel's desert bloom. He wanted to make it a productive agricultural land. Now, the biggest problem was that there was no water resources anywhere near Israel's desert. So it was a bit of a challenge. Israel is very small and thin and narrow. So the desert is the bottom 2/3, and the main water resource is up at the top. It's the Sea of Galilee. So he had a great idea. He said, I've got it. What we're going to do is we're going to build a national water pipeline all the way from the north, the Sea of Galilee, 250 kilometers down to the south, and we're going to bring water to the desert, and there we will have agriculture. So what did he do? He formed a team of engineers and he sent them on their way, telling them, this is your mission, go and make it happen. Well, the story has it that these engineers came back to the Prime Minister and said, Prime Minister, you know, with all due respect, you must be out of your mind. It's a completely impossible mission and it cannot be done. Now, Thierry, if you just skip to the next slide, you will see his response. David Ben-Gurion is allegedly meant to have responded while saying, well, if you can't do that, bring me the engineers who will make it happen. And lo and behold, in 1964, if you just skip to the next slide, Thierry, you will see here the Israel National Water Carrier that was opened, bringing water from the north all the way down to the south, enabling this agriculture to take place in the desert. Here in the picture is David Ben-Gurion there in the middle next to the former President Shimon Peres, and they're literally looking inside the construction pipes. Now, the second element here, which we believe is an enabling element, is innovation, something Apollos mentioned at the beginning. Now, I think what's important to mention here is that the Israeli government and society understood from the outset that without dedicated R&D and innovation, you will not have a successful agricultural sector. And this was really key to driving Israel's agricultural transformation. Now, the innovation ecosystem in Israel has two clear goals. The first is to solve the challenge facing the Israeli farmer, practical solutions for real-life challenges that they're facing on the ground. Now, the second goal of the innovation ecosystem is to bring new market opportunities to the farmers. For example, they are growing tomatoes. Could the innovation ecosystem actually increase the amount of varieties and bring them protocols for growing to allow them to expand the varieties of tomatoes that they're growing to meet market demands? Now, if we go to the next slide, Thierry, we will see the structure of Israel's innovation ecosystem, which is critically important. We call it internally the Golden Triangle. And what you're seeing here is at the top, the Volcani Center, Israel's National Agricultural R&D Center. On the right here, you've got the extension services who play that critical role, the agronomists disseminating the new knowledge and working hand in hand with the farmers. And on the left, you have these 8 regional R&D centers. Now, 8 for a very small country is quite a lot, and they were tasked with adapting any innovations to their locality and the conditions, because Israel is very climatically different across the country. Now, the 2 key striking things I want to point out are this basic triangle you're looking at. In the middle, here in red, is the farmer. Every player in the Israeli agricultural innovation ecosystem, their mandate is to focus on the needs of the farmer, nothing else. They are all working to serve the farmer. Now, the second point I want to point out is actually, you can't see it here on the screen, but this whole innovation ecosystem is characterized by a flat hierarchy. Now, my accent gives it away, but I'm originally from England, where there is a very strong hierarchy at present. But in Israel, there is no hierarchy. People are deemed equals, no matter your education or your monetary wealth. And I think you can see this with the way that we refer to our politicians by nicknames all the time. And here, as it applies to the innovation ecosystem, there was no perceived difference between the farmer and the top professor at the Volcani Center. Now, I think this is critical. This enables the free flow of information between all players, and they genuinely worked hand in hand. And what this ensures is 4 key things to make your agricultural innovation ecosystem work. First of all, it ensures that your innovators, your scientists, are working on the right challenge. And they know they're working on the right challenge because the farmer in the field will go into his greenhouse one day, he'll see something's wrong with his tomato, and he'll pick up the phone to one of the researchers at Volcani and say, this is the challenge, I'm going to bring it into the lab later today. So number 1, they're focusing on the right challenge. Number 2, because they're working hand in hand with all of the players constantly, they are developing an appropriate solution. It's not the case that they develop something in isolation, try and take it to the field, and actually it doesn't really fit the conditions. Now, the third thing is that they have an inbuilt adaptation system here through the 8 regional centers. Even if they've built this solution for this farmer with the tomato problem, it might need adapting between the north and the climate and the south. And the final thing that it does here is lay the foundations for widespread adoption and dissemination of new innovations, solutions, and protocols. One of the most common questions we get from delegations coming to Israel is like, well, how on earth do you convince your farmers to even adopt this new technology? And funnily enough, the answers of our innovators and our scientists is, what do you mean, how do we convince them to adopt it? Our job is to stop them adopting it because they want to adopt it too quickly. More often than not in Israel, the scientists do the research field trials in the fields with the farmers. And there's such a high level of trust and communication and faith of the farmers in the scientists that if the experiment is meant to last for 3 months, after a month, the farmer sees that it's working. They're like, quick, let's roll it out across the fields, and the researchers are left there protesting. So that, I think, is the critical key points of Israel's innovation structure and approach. Now, the third element here, enabling element, is actually about the market. Tiara, if you just click the slides forward, this is about the fact that Israel, even in its earliest days, when it was really relatively poor, it lacked national food security, it was rationing food. They did not just pursue a food security approach whereby its farmers were only producing staple crops. They actually pursued a dual approach for national food security and a market-led approach at the same time. Israel's farmers and government and innovation ecosystem always had an eye to the market demands. And this can be seen in 2 key ways, I think. The first, if you look back at the history of crops that Israel was growing, you will see that they started with cotton. When that didn't work out because of the market, they quickly shifted to flowers. When Kenya started getting very strong with flowers, they realized they couldn't compete, and they shifted once again to fruit tree crops, and today they're really pushing dates. And I think this market-driven approach is what led them to be successful too. Now, the second element here about a market-led approach was the government recognized it was essential. And it's very difficult for an individual farmer or a relatively sized farm to really compete with bargaining power in global value chains. So what they did, the government and the farmers together, was they set up an export entity called AGRA, whose mission was to expand the export potential of Israel. And this did a few things. First of all, they aggregated the farmers' produce. They enabled them to have great bargaining power versus huge buyers internationally. And internally in Israel, it reduced and prevented competition between the farmers. suddenly the farmers weren't competing against each other. They were working together with the Grexco to compete with other nations abroad. And that led to a very, very strong export industry from the outset. Now, the last 2 points I want to touch upon, one is farmer organization. Now, many of you might have heard of the kibbutz, and I don't know how old our audience is today. Maybe some of you even volunteered on a kibbutz back in the 70s in Israel. And very often people think that the kibbutz, which is basically a socialist cooperative, was the real driver of Israel's agricultural transformation. Now, what we learned by speaking to everybody was it's not quite true. What was the key driver was that Israel understood from the outset that the only way to succeed was through farmer organization. Farmers had to belong to units bigger than themselves. And Thierry, if we just skip forward a slide, or 2 slides even, we will see the structure of Israel's farmer organization. It didn't matter if you were in the communist/socialist ideology of the kibbutz. It didn't matter if you were part of a moshavim, which was a privatized form of the cooperative of kibbutz, or it doesn't matter if you were private farms. What is important to note here is every Israeli farmer belonged to a larger unit of farm organization. I think the breakdown in the early days was 40% were kibbutzim, 40% were moshavim, and 20% were private farms. And you can see this quote at the bottom of the page, which was one of Israel's leading agricultural economists that explains that he said, smallholders cannot survive unless they are connected to bigger units of production. And this is what enables them entry and competitive advantage into the markets. Now, the last point here I would just like to speak to is about international support. Chair, if we just skip down the slide. A lot of countries now are looking at leveraging international support, whether it's funding from donor agencies or perhaps diaspora. And this was, of course, the case with Israel. Israel here had an organization called the Jewish National Fund, and this blue box could probably be found in every Jewish home across the world. And every weekend when you had a bit of spare change from the end of the week, you would donate it to this box. And this money went to support the agricultural effort in the state of Israel. Now, what's important for me to emphasize here is that the money, the use of the money, was not determined nor by the donor, nor by the Jewish National Fund, but actually by the Israeli government. They had oversight of their plan, and they worked hand in hand to say, you know what, right now our priority is to build this water pipe. Let's put some of the money there. Right now our priority is to provide greenhouses to our farmers in the south, and that's where the money went. And that's how they were able to effectively harness the international support to drive their priorities. Thanks, Thierry.
Thanks very much, Danielle. A very good point. And a question came from the audience. Obviously, in developing countries, one of the key challenges of technology adoption is access to market. Some farmers are not really willing to adopt technologies because they know it's hard and difficult for them actually to access market. Jonathan, you've been to Israel. You've written about this case study. You work in Africa. What do you think worked in marketing of the agriculture produce in Israel? And what do you really think is the key lesson maybe the African farmer needs to learn from this process? As you speak to that, it will also be good just to speak to the research. As you looked at the triangle that Danielle presented, research is still given a huge importance. Today Volcani has over 200 researchers, and they are still really getting a lot of funding because research is extremely important. On the other hand, on the continent, research is not really being given the right priority. What do you really think are the key lessons developing countries, and particularly Africa in particular, can learn from Israel? Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Terry. I think the key thing is really about for me, it's a combination of these factors here that Danielle has talked about that came out in terms of the key elements in Israel, but it's that hook around the market-led approach which is important, which I feel from the work I've done across the continent needs to be strengthened a lot, and it takes time to be strengthened, and for the flow of information to work through the system over time, such that the system builds trust and starts to work much better. And the flow there is from understanding where can we sell our produce in a way that brings us both incomes and food security at the same time, and the dual system, I think that's really important to recognize. I think this has been lacking from my perspective, at least across across a number of African countries. But that hook to understanding, okay, we can sell our horticulture, our citrus, our cotton, and even our commodities, not necessarily for food purposes. We can sell them abroad and get income. And let's understand that and then work back from that. So we organize our farmers in a way that works for that. And so there's collaboration and not competition between within the country trying to capture a small market. And we can orient our research, crucially to your point, to your last point, specifically to that. So the problems, I think we should stop using the word research and in the sense of agriculture transformation. Research is important, but we should start calling it problem solving. It should be problem solving, which of course requires research, but also requires other things as well to make sure that we are making sure we can access that market and together have that collaborative approach. And I think that's what's been missing. So the system then is anchored to that. And that's, I think, how we can help create this linkages between the role of government, the role of the private sector and marketeers, whether it's central agencies, like a cocoa board equivalent in Ghana, for example, on cocoa, or the various produce agencies that exist across central agencies across countries in Africa, and whether it's farmers as well, that they're working within the system and the flow of money is coming in, the flow of information is coming in, and there's a feedback mechanism between them and that collaboration. I think that's the anchoring, I think, that that often has been missing, because there's been, at least in the last 30 or 40 years, in my view, there's been a lot of focus on production, but not on this dual approach, food security plus export orientation, which is really important, as well as on making sure that that agriculture is a means to incomes as well as food as well. So I think that's the key anchor that we need to emphasize from here.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think one question from the audience, I think it's from John Masharia. He's asking, there have been a lot of study tours of African agriculture specialists actually coming from benchmarking study tours in Israel, but we are not seeing the same results on the continent. Daniel, you are on the other side working with Israeli researchers traveling consistently in Africa. What do you think is not working on the continent?
I think this is something I learned also from Jonathan, actually, that the need for a government-wide holistic approach. I think if I succeeded at all in trying to tell this story of Israel, the message I would have got across is all of the elements that came to play together. And without all of them coming to play simultaneously, I doubt whether you can really move the needle. For example, even if you've got strong government support to the farmers, but you've got a non-existent innovation ecosystem, how are you going to give your farmers the solutions that they need and the support that they need? If you've got the innovation system at play, but the lack of support from the government at the same time, I also think it will be very challenging to get it across. I do think in terms of how Israel could offer assistance to move the needle forward as well, I think one-off study tours are great. I would welcome you all again, especially if you haven't been to Israel, to come and visit at some point when it's possible, to see firsthand and see some of the learnings. But I do think it requires a more in-depth investment and a holistic approach. And I think if anything could be taken from Israel in terms of partnering today to move that forward, I think you could look at both doing agri-study tours in Israel to see firsthand how it's happening. I think you could look at collaboration with Israel's highly developed agricultural R&D system. I think you could look at engagement with some of Israel's top agronomists and scientists, specifically agronomists. I didn't speak about the extension service and system, but the extension service in Israel was very unique in that the extension officers were not generalists. They weren't like your GP, the doctor you go to for all maladies and things. They were highly specialized. And they told us, the head of the extension service in Israel, well, of course we're highly specialized. You can't expect one person to be the expert on tomatoes and on dairy and things like that. So I think the engagement with some of Israel's top agronomists and experts might be able to help as well. And I just think basic the answer is the holistic approach and using all of these elements together. And I think that has to be led by the governments.
Thank you, Danielle. Many people would be wondering now, what's in it for us? You know, if we have a government participant who is in the audience listening, or development partners who are really supporting various agriculture investments on the continent, or even private sector actors. They'll be wondering, I mean, this is a fascinating story. It's even difficult to believe, actually, unless you've been there and see what's actually happening on the ground. I would like to invite Jonathan to focus now on those key lessons we think are actually relevant to Africa, because some of these, what we are hearing today is very, very contextualized to Israel specific context, geographical location. But there are those key lessons we believe are relevant to developing countries that are already willing or that have already started embarking on this agriculture transformation journey. Jonathan, can you be brief and concise as usual and focus on those key lessons you think are relevant to the African context, starting with, from government perspective?
Sure, absolutely. I'm grateful if you can just go to the next slide. So, so just three quick things to say. First, on government, I think the key thing is the importance of the championing of the national vision, and it's not just about agriculture as a line ministry or as a line sector amongst 20 other sectors that governments have to deal with. It's actually central to the whole vision of progress, of developing the middle class, of industrializing the country. And so really embedding that vision and championing it from the top is an essential part. But the people at the top also need to be supported by the bureaucrats, by the civil service, by people around them, in order for them to be bold in one sense, to sort of focus on what's going to drive revenues, what's going to drive export potential, in order to give the politicians the platform they need to drive the agenda. So many presidents, we work with many presidents across the country, they want to drive such a similar agenda, and some are, as we know, but even those that don't seem to be want to, but they need a mechanism for managing the politics around it, for coordinating, crucially, for getting that coordination to manage the political challenges. And this is where the collaboration becomes important. Collaboration between ministries is crucial. We saw the crucial role, we didn't have time to mention it, but the Ministry of Trade and Industry, the Ministry of Finance in Israel were crucial here in order to take that holistic view, especially on the market side. And they were collaborating very closely with the Ministry of Agriculture. The Ministry of Agriculture had a Department of Trade within it, which many countries in Africa do not have. The Departments of Trade and the Ministries of Agriculture rarely talk together unless they need to tick some boxes at the WTO or something like that. I'm exaggerating, of course, but there was much more collaboration here in Israel because it was all market-led. So that market-led approach is crucial. And then being able to prioritize, as Danielle said, focus on cotton. Okay, that didn't work. Let's move on. Focus on horticulture. That worked for some time. For like, when I say some time, it worked for 5 or 10 years. Then they moved on. Now they're a lead in various horticulture sub-value chains. So that prioritization, so you're getting different parts of government working around those key value chains that have business potential, have a strong economic case to compete, either externally or of course with import substitution. But even if you're supporting domestic market, you're still competing globally because you're competing with imports coming in from elsewhere. So that focus on that is really crucial, and really investing a lot in that coordination, which takes a lot of effort, and we shouldn't get stuck with coordination equals structures and committees and so on. It's not about that. It's more about actually problem solving. So specific problems, specific value chains, specific markets we're targeting, and then players we need to bring in, whether they're farmers, researchers, businesses, around that plan. And that's I think also have to think about coordination differently in government. On the next slide, so the second aspect is about development partners. How is this relevant to development partners? I think there's some key lessons here. Rachel, if you can change the slide, Thierry. So the first is development partners can do a lot. Obviously, there's work that can be done at farmer level to empower farmers, strengthening of cooperatives. And I think we need to revisit how that's done. So we're better focused on the governance of those cooperatives in the different ways they are organized. It's not just about cooperatives, it's about farmer organization, which can be done in various ways. Like in Israel, there were also associations and so on. strengthening the visionary SMEs, the small businesses, and industry, agro-processing in particular, so working with them. And a lot of it comes through management support. It's better that all of these types of private entities, farmers, small businesses, agro-processors, larger agro-processors are managed, governed themselves, the stronger they are. And then on the government side, it's really about helping, which I think we've struggled with a lot, the singular programming. So the fact that, as Danielle said, the money that was coming into Israel to help agriculture was programmed by the government. It was not programmed in Washington or London or a mix of all of these places, or within governments programmed in different parts of the government. It came through the central planning mechanism out of the Prime Minister's office, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Agriculture. Doing the analysis with government and not for government and through local think tanks is really important. So it's joint analysis of which value chains, which problems to solve within specific value chains, etc. And work with government to tackle challenges together, rather than saying, okay, they're not addressing this challenge, which I think is important, therefore I'm not going to support them. So really investing in that local and the government's vision, which will take time, is really important, and using that to address challenges together and overcome them in the ups and in the downs. And then exploring new approaches for how we can support the key functions of government that are necessary to put a singular plan, a NIPE, for example, the implementation of key flagships together. And finally, the balancing of the technical with the political. International support tends to, it tends to come with a strong technical focus. This is what needs to happen, this is what needs to happen. But politicians have to balance the political, and political will come first above everything. And so we need to see that sometimes the second best, the third best, the fourth best from a technical standpoint are better than nothing. So balancing that is really a crucial factor we need to take more into account. Last thing, I'll just briefly talk about COVID, and Apollos, you mentioned this at the beginning, the elephant in the room. I think the key thing to take away from this is that if you look at Israel in the 1960s, its GDP per capita, a lot of factors, its geographic, its level of infrastructure, for example, a lot of factors were similar to where many countries across the continent in Africa might be today. And so while COVID is exposing or shining a light on many vulnerabilities in the agriculture sector, across value chains and disruptions that we're seeing that COVID has highlighted, the key thing I think to take away is that from this Israel case study for COVID is that back in the 50s and even before that, there was this crisis mindset, and Danielle alluded to this, a mindset of how we're going to survive, basically, how we're going to make this work. We have to make it work, and we have to work towards strengthening the vulnerabilities in our agriculture system, and using therefore that mindset of crisis positively, putting a positive angle on it in order to strengthen local production and local resilience in a market-led way. That's really important. Otherwise, we end up not being able to compete, and eventually local production will suffer. And that parallel focus on food security and cash crops is really important, because cash crops, and especially cash crops that can lead to innovation, downstream innovation, and local value added, bring in income and strengthen the system. And the trusted institutions and resilient and strengthening of that mindset to develop, for national development is really key to get that collaboration going between these different actors, farmers, private industry, government, that need to work together to get this transformation. So I think that's the key angle that we need to see here from COVID, or even recognizing that there are, of course, many specific various challenges on the ground. But the bottom line, I think, is this one. Thierry?
I think we have 5 minutes left. Very interesting questions coming in. But at this point, I want to bring in Apollos. Apollos, you lead policy, state capability, regional food trade. Fantastic stories from Israel on how government really was a pioneer of what we're seeing today. How relevant is the area you are leading today on the African continent? And what do you really think needs to be done to make sure that governments can play their critical role in promoting the farmer we want really to make a hero And how do you really turn agriculture into a national project? Quickly, just in 1 minute.
Yeah, sure, Thierry. I think Jonathan has spoken a lot to that. But I think what's important and the critical thing is that we should take a political economy approach to agriculture. And like I was saying, when I earlier spoke, particularly now that we know that COVID is going to be with us at least for the medium term, then if economies are going to recover and grow, then we should put agriculture either at the center of economic growth or as one of the strategic pillars that government will take. So, for example, Kenya has what it calls the Big Four. Agriculture is one of them, and it's putting its money where its mouth is. And I think that's what governments need to do. But beyond putting the money, that's part of the leadership, and that's part of thinking or taking a political economy approach. I think the second thing that's critical is that we must show stronger leadership from our governments. I mean, we saw the case with Israel, what David Ben-Gurion did, by saying, look, if you guys are not going to do this, then find me somebody who can. So as far as he was concerned, from where he was sitting as at that time, there was nothing like it was not going to happen under his watch. So, and it did happen. He made sure it happened. So I think that's the kind of leadership that we need, going forward. A third thing that's really important is around the fact that, we need to put our farmers at the center, of this transformation. So let me say this quickly before I stop. You see, we have a certain system in many of our African countries that looks at hierarchy, class, and the fact that, and because of that, the farmer is not seen as critical to transformation. The farmer is rather seen as a beneficiary or on the receiving end, but rather as, so the farmer is seen as, a beneficiary of the transformation rather than being put at the center of that transformation. So I think that's the shifts that our governments need to make. That's the kind of shifts that we need to make in systems, such that the farmer is at the center and the farmer is able to provide that leadership that the research institutions, the government practitioners, the private sector and others are able to build themselves around, and then build a transformation that ensures that the farmer is able to drive growth, from his farm or her farm, wherever they are. I think that was what Israel did. And I think that we need to make, so those are the three shifts that we need to make going forward.
Thank you very much, Apollos. 3 minutes left. Mirav, what will you not forget about this? You've taken part in this journey. You are still working as a technology and innovation advisor to the Tony Blair Institute, working both in Israel and Africa. What are those really key lessons you are going to continue promoting in your current work? In 20 seconds, if you can, please.
Okay. So in the risk of repeating my colleagues, I will just say very briefly that first and foremost, the well-managed farmer corporations, and I'm a kibbutz granddaughter, so I support them. So the farmer corporations and the governing institutions that really enable the farmers to farm and do what they do best and only focus on growing their best produce and the best quality and not taking care of any other aspect of the value chain is extremely important. Also, that also provided them insurance and training, inputs and access to markets. So really very important thing. Second thing I would say is what Jonathan spoke about, the effective prioritization and planning that really enable these unbelievable, unequivocal allocation of budget that enabled the infrastructure and enabled the big projects. And thirdly, I'll go back to what Apollo said at the beginning of the innovation and the need of innovation in African farmers, in the mindset that needs to change. And for that, you need investment in, R&D and higher education, but not for the sake of academy, but rather the sake of applied research for growth, because as I see it, one of the biggest assets of Israel is the innovation oriented farmer.
Daniel, now you know that there are very good relevant lessons that Africa and developing countries in general can actually borrow from Israel. You are leading Volcani International Partnership. How is your work going to be shaped by these lessons, the lessons we are seeing today, and how that is going to translate into actions on the ground, particularly in those countries that are willing actually to embark on a journey Israel went through? 1 minute, please.
All in 1 minute? Okay, I'll take on the challenge. So I think, first of all, even though I knew the story of Israel's agricultural transformation, every time I reread our case study or we do a session like this, it inspires me all over again. And I think, or I hope that this story could serve as great inspiration to everyone here today that's actually aspiring for something similar, and actually give the confidence that it is possible. In terms of our organization and what we're doing, I can see a great interest and request from different partners across the globe and Africa, whether they be government or international organizations or foundations, to partner with Israel and try and access something that Israel has got going on. How can we benefit from Israel's experience, its expertise, its technologies that exist, or its capacity to innovate and solve new challenges? And our role is really to offer or extend that hand in partnership, and to say if anybody out there is interested in understanding how they could benefit or engage or partner with Israel to replicate some of the things that Israel did, then our door is always open, and we would be honored to work with you or help to connect you to the right players in Israel to make sure that this experience and expertise can be applied effectively on the ground.
Jonathan, in your last 1 minute, it would be good just to speak to one question that came through the audience on market. Again, the question is, does really government provide market in the case of Israel? Why everything seems to be working? So one of the audience participants is actually asking if in Israel governments are providing markets to the farmer, and that is actually creating incentives for the farming activity to attract many people as we see. But also it'll be important for you to speak about partnership. This is AGRA, this is TBI, Volcani Institute, working in different geographies, but fundamentally all working for the smallholder farmers. What would you want to see in the next 5 to 10 years? What would this partnership really yield at for the farmer to be that hero? What do you think needs to be done for Africa to turn the farmer who's now neglected into that national hero?
Okay, so two parts to that. So the first part, I think the government does have a role to play in helping farmers and importantly also other SMEs across the value chain to access markets. Not necessarily always directly, sometimes directly, but always in collaboration with the players themselves, with the SMEs and with agro-industry and with farmer organizations themselves. We saw this in Israel with the citrus board, which started since the 1920s basically, and built up from there. And it's not something which is a 5-year project and is done. It takes time to build it, but the government has a role to play in empowering those market linkages. So it's not necessarily that they're going to go to, I don't know, to England or somewhere to look for markets for farmers. That's not the role of government to do that. But they do have a role to collaborate with players to help, especially players that are involved with access to markets, exporters, etc., to dialogue with them and understand the constraints, the problems they're facing, to target the markets where they think there is a market that can improve, that can feed back into farmers, as well as helping investors or local investors as well as foreign investors to invest in processing, because agro-processing and value addition locally strengthens markets for farmers because it gives them much more stable markets in the country, and it's the processes that, rather than commodities going up and down each year, which ruin farmer incentives, and this then allows farmers to invest and to build that relationship with processors on the ground. So I think facilitating that market enabling system and problem solving around it, including sometimes with maybe boards which have private sector and government officials on them, marketing boards, for example, should be explored. and could be explored as well, but within the context of a market system. On your second point, quickly on partnerships, I mean, I think this anchoring is really important. The fact that we need to be able to compromise, and I think sometimes there isn't that compromising. So compromising and collaborating towards a common goal, in which we all have to benefit from an economic standpoint and a political standpoint. If we can understand those two, what is going to work politically for the politicians in the room, as well as economically for farmers on the ground and for businesses. And this is where a focus on specific value chains, much more than we've done before, I think will help a lot, because we've tried to address 20 value chains when we could be focusing on 2 and making sure the country gets those 2 or 3 right. And then if they fail, we try others. But at least let's focus on those where there's some analysis jointly done that suggests we can compete and many farmers can benefit. And this is the role of government, this is the role of the private sector, this is the role of farmer organizations. And let's work together. And the export mindedness helps, because then we're not competing with each other. We need to collaborate with each other so we all succeed. And that key mindset, I think, is crucial for a successful partnership.
Fantastic. It's time now. We are 5 minutes over time. Thank you very much for all of us. Thank you to the panelists and thank you to the audience. I hope you've found this session quite engaging and rich. We have a book that has been published as a result of this, as a result of this case study that has been documented. For those who haven't received it, we are actually, you can have it from TBI and Volcani as well as AGRA website. It's downloadable free of charge. It's full of fantastic stuff. We've only been able actually to share the summary and the highlights. So I would invite you just to strongly look at it and see what you can learn from Israel. Fantastic stuff happening. I wish you a very, very good day. Jen, over to you.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. We will share details of the next webinar happening next week. We thank you all and thank you for joining. Most appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.